In the small coastal town of Brackenshore, where the morning fog rolled gently across the harbor like soft cotton settling over sleeping boats, there stood a modest pottery studio tucked between a weathered bookshop and a bakery that filled the street with the warm scent of cinnamon each dawn. The studio had moss-green shutters that had faded beautifully over many seasons, and a hand-painted sign that swayed peacefully in the salt breeze, reading simply, Marlow Ceramics. Eleanor Marlow had opened this studio 7 years ago, in the quiet months following her mother's passing, when grief had wrapped itself around her heart like winter ivy, and she had needed something to do with her hands. She had needed something that would allow her to shape sorrow into something useful, something beautiful, something that could hold warmth and tea and wildflowers gathered from the meadows beyond the town. Her mother had been a ceramicist, too, in a small way, making plates and bowls for the family table, teaching young Eleanor to feel the clay respond to gentle pressure, to understand that patience and persistence could transform the formless into the beautiful. Those lessons had lain dormant for many years, buried beneath the demands of adulthood and the compromises of marriage, but they had never truly disappeared. And when her mother passed, leaving behind her modest savings and her old pottery wheel and the memories of afternoons spent together in companionable silence, Eleanor had known what she needed to do. The studio had been a wreck when she first found it, neglected for years, its windows grimy, its walls stained with water damage, its floor thick with dust and debris. But she had seen past all that to something else. The good bones of the building, the quality of the light that came through the large front windows, the way the space seemed to hold a particular kind of quiet, a particular kind of potential. She had spent those first months cleaning and repairing, learning the building's quirks and charms, making it her own. She had painted the walls a warm cream color and installed the shelving herself, buying wood from Mr. Whitmore's hardware store and spending long evenings with a hammer and nails and a stubbornness that surprised even her. She had set up her mother's wheel in the spot with the best light and arranged her tools on the pegboard behind it, each tool in its proper place, each one carrying memories of lessons learned and skills passed down. On this particular October morning, the kind where autumn had begun to settle into the bones of the earth and the maple trees along the harbor road had turned the color of honeyed amber, Eleanor arrived at her studio before the sun had fully risen. She walked slowly along the cobblestone street, her wool cardigan wrapped close against the gentle chill, her breath forming small clouds that dissolved softly into the gray-blue air. She was 43 years old now, with silver beginning to thread through her chestnut hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and tears. Her hands were strong and capable, roughened slightly by years of working with clay, and there was a quietness about her that people in Brackenshore had come to recognize as the particular piece of someone who had learned to find contentment in simple things. The morning light was soft and forgiving, filtering through the mist in gentle shafts that made the wet cobblestones gleam like polished stones beneath her feet. Eleanor paused for a moment outside the bakery, breathing in the warm scent of fresh bread and watching a seagull circle lazily overhead, its cry distant and melancholy against the gray morning sky. There was something comforting about the predictability of these mornings, about knowing that the bakery would always smell of yeast and honey, that the seagulls would always call their ancient songs, that the tide would always come and go in its eternal rhythm. She continued past the bookshop, its windows still dark, past the hardware store where Mr. Whitmore was just unlocking his door and raised his hand in a quiet wave, past the small cafe where steam fogged the windows and early risers hunched over cups of coffee, their faces soft and sleepy in the morning light. The studio smelled of damp earth and dried lavender when she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Morning light filtered through the windows in soft, dusty beams, illuminating the rows of finished pottery waiting on wooden shelves, mugs glazed in ocean blues and forest greens, bowls the color of autumn leaves, vases shaped like gentle curves of coastline. Each piece held something of Eleanor's heart, some small measure of the peace she had cultivated over these years of quiet rebuilding. She moved through her morning ritual with the unhurried grace of long practice, lighting the small wood stove in the corner, filling the copper kettle with water from the old stone sink, measuring loose-leaf chamomile into her favorite teapot, one she had made herself in those early months when her hands had still trembled with fresh grief. The teapot was imperfect, slightly lopsided, glazed in a blue that had turned out darker than she had intended, but she loved it precisely for its imperfections, for the way it reminded her that beauty could emerge from uncertainty. These morning rituals had become sacred to Eleanor over the years, small ceremonies that marked the transition from sleep to waking, from the private world of dreams to the shared world of work and connection. She had learned, in those difficult first months after her divorce, that such rituals were essential to her well-being, anchors that kept her grounded when everything else felt unstable, touchstones that reminded her who she was and what she valued. The wood stove caught slowly, as it always did on cold mornings, the kindling crackling and popping as the flames grew stronger. Eleanor stood before it for a moment, warming her hands, watching the fire dance behind the small glass window in the stove door. Fire had always fascinated her, the way it transformed things, the way it could destroy or create depending on how it was handled. Her kiln used fire too, of course, to harden the clay and set the glazes, to transform soft, shapeless earth into something permanent and beautiful. As the kettle began its soft whistle and steam rose in gentle curls toward the ceiling, Eleanor settled onto her worn wooden stool before the pottery wheel and allowed herself a moment of stillness. Through the window, she could see the harbor beginning to wake, fishing boats preparing for the morning's work, seagulls calling their ancient songs, the lighthouse on the distant point, standing patient and steadfast against the pearl-gray sky. This was the life she had built for herself after everything had fallen apart. This was the sanctuary she had created from the ruins of her marriage, from the ashes of a future she had once believed was certain. And though the path had been difficult, though there had been seasons of such profound loneliness that she had wondered if she would ever feel whole again, she had found her way to something that felt, at last, like home. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, though the marriage had ended long before that. Ended in the slow, sad way that some marriages do, not with dramatic confrontation, but with the gradual erosion of connection, the quiet accumulation of disappointments and misunderstandings, until two people who had once loved each other found themselves strangers sharing the same house. Her ex-husband, Thomas, had been a businessman, practical and ambitious, and he had never quite understood Eleanor's need to create, her desire to shape clay into vessels of beauty rather than pursue what he considered more sensible work. In the early years, he had tolerated her pottery as a hobby, something quaint and charming that his wife did in her spare time. But as her passion grew and she began to dream of opening her own studio, the tension between them had deepened into something harder, something that could not be smoothed away with gentle words or quiet compromise. When she had used her inheritance from her mother, the modest sum that had been left to her along with her mother's old recipes and her grandmother's wedding ring, to open Marlow Ceramics, Thomas had been quietly furious. He had seen it as a foolish investment, a waste of resources that could have been put towards something more practical, more profitable. And though he had never forbidden her from pursuing her dream, his disapproval had hung over their marriage like a persistent fog, dimming whatever light had once existed between them. The divorce, when it finally came, had been Thomas's decision. He had met someone else, he explained with the detached efficiency he brought to all his business dealings. Someone who shared his vision for the future, someone who understood that success required focus and pragmatism rather than what he called Eleanor's artistic daydreaming. He had expected her to be devastated, perhaps even to beg him to reconsider, but Eleanor had felt only a quiet relief, like setting down a burden she had carried for so long that she had forgotten it was heavy. She had kept the studio, of course. It was hers, paid for with her mother's gift, and Thomas had no legal claim to it. But he had kept the house they had shared, along with most of their savings, and Eleanor had found herself starting over at 40, with nothing but her pottery and a small apartment above a hardware store, and the stubborn, steadfast belief that she could build something meaningful from the clay of her own two hands. The first year had been the hardest. She remembered those months with a clarity that was sometimes painful, sometimes tender. The long nights when sleep would not come, the mornings when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain, the afternoons when she would sit before her wheel and find that her hands had forgotten how to create. She remembered the kindness of strangers who became friends, the cup of tea that Margaret had brought to her one dark February afternoon when Eleanor had been sitting alone in her studio, tears streaming silently down her face. She remembered the slow, gradual return of hope, like spring arriving after a particularly long winter, uncertain at first, then growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. She remembered the first piece she had sold after the divorce, a simple mug glazed in a blue-gray that reminded her of stormy seas, purchased by a tourist who had wandered in from the rain and stood for a long time examining Eleanor's work before choosing that particular piece. "It's beautiful," the woman had said, holding the mug carefully in her hands. "There's something about it that feels like comfort." And Eleanor had felt something crack open in her chest, some frozen place beginning to thaw. Because if she could create comfort, if she could shape something beautiful from her own brokenness, then perhaps she was not as lost as she had feared. And she had. Slowly, patiently, with the same careful attention she brought to shaping each bowl and mug and vase, Eleanor had built her business into something that sustained her. Marlow Ceramics had become a beloved fixture in Brackenshore, a place where tourists stopped to purchase handmade souvenirs and locals came to order custom pieces for weddings and anniversaries and the quiet celebrations of ordinary life. She was not wealthy, but she was comfortable, and more importantly, she was content. Or she had been until last month. The autumn had been unusually mild that year, the kind of Indian summer that makes people linger outdoors longer than they should, reluctant to surrender to the coming cold. Eleanor had been having one of her best seasons, her pottery flying off the shelves as tourists, made last visits before the winter arrived and the town grew quiet again. She had been happy, she realized in retrospect, truly happy in the uncomplicated way of someone whose basic needs are met, whose work is meaningful, whose days are filled with purpose and connection. It was the kind of happiness she had almost stopped believing was possible during those dark years of her marriage, the kind of quiet contentment that does not announce itself but simply exists, steady and warm, like the glow of a well-tended fire. And then the letter had arrived. Eleanor poured her tea and watched the steam rise in delicate spirals, thinking about the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago, the official-looking envelope with its crisp-typed address that had seemed to carry weight even before she opened it. The letter had been from a company called Coastal Development Partners, informing her that they had purchased the building that housed her studio and the 2 adjacent shops, and that her lease would not be renewed when it expired at the end of the year. The news had settled over her like a cold wave, numbing at first and then gradually, painfully coming into focus. She had 3 months to find a new location for her studio, 3 months to uproot everything she had built, 3 months to start over once again. She had made inquiries, of course, had spent long hours walking through Brackenshore, looking at available spaces, calculating costs, trying to imagine how she might begin again in an unfamiliar location. But rent in the town had increased dramatically over the past few years, as more tourists discovered the charm of the coastal village, and the spaces she could afford were either too small for her kiln and wheel and shelves of inventory, or located in areas so far from the main street that customers would never find her. The worry had begun to press against her chest like a physical weight, disturbing her sleep, stealing the peace she had worked so hard to cultivate. And though she tried to hold on to her faith that somehow, some way, things would work out, there were moments when despair crept in like tidewater through cracks in a seawall, threatening to flood the sanctuary she had built. What made it worse, what added a sharp edge to her worry, was the quiet suspicion that had begun to form in the back of her mind. The suspicion that this was not simply bad luck or unfortunate timing, but something more deliberate, more personal. Because the signature at the bottom of the letter, the name of the managing partner of Coastal Development Partners, had been Thomas Blackwood, her ex-husband. Eleanor took a long, slow breath and let it out in a soft sigh that seemed to carry some of the tension from her shoulders. She did not know for certain that Thomas had targeted her building specifically, that this was some kind of delayed revenge for the divorce or for her refusal to give up her studio when he had wanted her to. It was possible, she told herself, that this was simply coincidence, that Thomas's company had purchased the building for sound business reasons without any thought of her at all. But she knew Thomas, knew the particular brand of his pride and his need for control, and something in her heart whispered that this was not coincidence at all. She shook her head gently, as if to clear away the troubling thoughts, and turned her attention to the clay waiting on her wheel. Whatever Thomas's intentions, whatever challenges lay ahead, she had learned over these past years that the only way forward was through one careful, patient step at a time, one shaped vessel at a time, one ordinary day at a time. The clay was cool and damp beneath her hands as she began to center it on the wheel, her foot pressing the pedal in a slow, steady rhythm that had become as natural to her as breathing. There was something almost meditative about this process, something that quieted the worried chatter of her mind and brought her fully into the present moment. The feel of the clay responding to her touch, the soft whir of the wheel, the gentle morning light warming her shoulders through the window. She was shaping a mug, one of a set she was making for a customer's wedding gift, and as her hands coaxed the clay upward into a cylinder, she let herself sink into the familiar comfort of creation. Whatever else might be uncertain in her life, this was something she knew, something she could trust. The simple, ancient magic of turning earth into beauty, of shaping formless clay into vessels that would hold warmth and nourishment and the small daily rituals of a life well lived. The hours passed in their gentle, unhurried way, as hours tend to do when hands are busy with meaningful work. Eleanor shaped and trimmed and set pieces aside to dry, pausing now and then to sip her tea or gaze out the window at the harbor, where the fog had lifted and the water had turned the pale silver blue of autumn afternoons. Around midday, the bell above her door chimed softly, and she looked up to see Margaret Chen stepping into the studio, her gray hair pinned up in its usual loose bun, her arms full of brown paper packages tied with string. Margaret owned the bookshop next door and had been Eleanor's neighbor and friend since the very beginning. She was 72 years old, with a kind of weathered grace that spoke of a life fully lived, and she had a way of appearing at exactly the moments when Eleanor most needed companionship or wisdom or simply a cup of tea shared in comfortable silence. There was something almost mystical about Margaret's timing, Eleanor had often thought, the way she always seemed to know when Eleanor was struggling, when a friendly face would make all the difference. Perhaps it was just the natural attentiveness of someone who had spent her life surrounded by stories, who had learned to read people the way she read books, or perhaps it was something deeper, some invisible thread of connection that allowed true friends to sense each other's needs across the barriers of walls and silence. Margaret's eyes took in the studio with their usual quick assessment, noting the clay covered on the wheel, the finished pieces drying on their shelves, the slight tension in Eleanor's shoulders that betrayed her inner turmoil. She said nothing about any of this, though. Margaret had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to help someone was not to name their struggle, but simply to be present with them, to offer comfort without demanding explanation. "I brought lunch," Margaret announced, setting her packages on the small table by the window. "Soup from the cafe and bread from Dawson's, still warm. You've been in here since dawn, and I'd wager you haven't eaten a thing." Eleanor smiled, wiping her hands on her apron as she rose from her stool. "You know me too well." "I know that you forget to take care of yourself when you're worried," Margaret said gently, her dark eyes soft with understanding. "And I know you've been carrying something heavy these past few weeks. I thought perhaps you might like to set it down for a moment and share a meal with an old friend." They settled at the small table together, unwrapping the packages to reveal containers of butternut squash soup, golden and fragrant with sage, and a loaf of crusty bread that filled the studio with the warm, yeasty smell of home. Outside, the afternoon light had turned soft and amber, casting long shadows across the cobblestones and making the harbor water sparkle like scattered coins. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that exists between people who have known each other long enough that words are not always necessary. Eleanor felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, loosened by the warmth of the soup and the simple comfort of Margaret's presence. "I heard about the building," Margaret said finally, her voice quiet and matter-of-fact. "The Hendersons at the bakery told me this morning. They received the same letter." Eleanor nodded slowly, setting down her spoon. "I've been trying not to think about it too much, trying to just focus on the work and trust that something will work out. But it's hard, Margaret. This place, the studio, it's more than just a business to me. It's where I found myself again after everything fell apart." Margaret reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand with her own, her touch warm and steady. "I know, dear, and I want you to know that whatever happens, you're not alone in this. The Hendersons feel the same way, and old Mr. Whitmore at the bookshop. We've all built our lives in this little corner of Brackenshore, and we're not going to let anyone push us out without a fight." "But what can we do?" Eleanor asked, and she could hear the weariness in her own voice, the quiet despair that she had been trying so hard to keep at bay. "Thomas, the company that bought the building, they have the legal right to do what they want with it. They've offered us fair market value for our leases, offered to help us relocate. On paper, everything is above board." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her wise old eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "the things that matter most can't be measured on paper. Sometimes the value of a place isn't in its square footage or its location or its potential for profit. Sometimes it's in the memories held within its walls, in the community it serves, in the way it makes people feel when they walk through its doors. She paused, taking a sip of her tea, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. I've learned a few things in my 72 years, Eleanor, and one of the most important is this. When you're facing something difficult, the first thing to do is gather information. Understand what you're truly dealing with, because often things are not quite as they appear on the surface. Eleanor looked at her friend, something stirring in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something that might grow into hope if given time and care. What do you mean? Margaret smiled, a slow, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. I mean that I've been doing a bit of research of my own, and I've discovered some interesting things about this Coastal Development Partners, things that suggest there may be more to this situation than meets the eye. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she slid across the table to Eleanor. A friend of mine works at the county records office. She helped me look into the purchase of our building, and she found something curious. The company that bought it, Coastal Development Partners, it's not really a development company at all. It's a shell corporation, recently formed with only one recorded asset, our building. And the managing partner, Thomas Blackwood, he's the only listed member. Eleanor unfolded the paper and stared at the lines of text, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. I don't understand. Why would Thomas create a fake company just to buy this building? That's the question, isn't it? Margaret said softly. And I think the answer might be found if we look a little deeper, because according to my friend, there's something unusual about the property records for this building, something that goes back many years, long before either of us opened our shops here. Eleanor felt a strange sensation, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, like peering into fog that might lift at any moment to reveal something unexpected. What kind of something? Margaret shook her head slowly. I don't know yet. The records are incomplete, tangled up in old deeds and transfers that weren't properly filed. But I have a feeling, Eleanor, the kind of feeling that comes from reading thousands of stories over the years, that there's a thread here worth following, and I think you might be surprised by where it leads. Eleanor sat with those words for a moment, feeling them settle into her consciousness like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples outward in all directions. A thread worth following. She had always been drawn to such threads, in stories, in art, in life itself. The idea that there might be some hidden narrative running beneath the surface of her current crisis, some deeper pattern waiting to be discovered, stirred something in her that had been dormant for weeks. Hope, she realized. It was hope, tender and tentative, like the first green shoots pushing through snow at the end of a long winter. Not the naive hope that everything would magically work out, but something quieter and more grounded. The hope that came from knowing there were still paths unexplored, still possibilities not yet considered. The afternoon light had begun to fade, casting the studio in soft shades of gold and shadow. Eleanor looked around at her pottery, at the life she had built within these walls, and she felt something shift inside her, something small but significant, like the first crack of light at the edge of dawn. What do you suggest we do? She asked. Margaret smiled and patted her hand gently. Tomorrow I'm going to introduce you to someone, an old friend of mine who might be able to help us understand what's really going on here. But for now, finish your soup, dear, and try to rest tonight. Whatever comes next, you'll face it better with a full stomach and a good night's sleep. Eleanor nodded slowly, and though the worry was still there, pressing at the edges of her awareness, she felt something else alongside it now. A quiet, tentative sense that perhaps she was not as alone in this as she had feared, that perhaps there were still paths forward she had not yet discovered. Outside, the sun was setting over the harbor, painting the sky in soft watercolors of rose and gold and deepening blue. The boats were returning from their day's work, their lights beginning to flicker on like small earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance, Eleanor could hear the gentle rhythm of waves against the shore, that ancient, eternal song that had soothed troubled hearts since the beginning of time. She finished her soup and walked Margaret to the door, hugging her friend tightly before watching her disappear into the evening twilight. Then she turned back to her studio, to her pottery and her wheel and the quiet work that waited for her, and she began to close up for the night. As she moved through the familiar rituals, covering the clay, rinsing her tools, banking the wood stove, she found herself thinking about what Margaret had said, about threads worth following and things that were not quite as they appeared. And though she did not know what tomorrow would bring, she felt a small flame of something like courage kindling in her chest, warm and steady against the gathering dark. The walk home took her along the harbor road, past the old lighthouse keeper's cottage and the small community garden where late-season flowers still bloomed in defiant colors against the autumn chill. Her apartment was modest, 2 rooms above Henderson's hardware, with slanted ceilings and windows that looked out over the rooftops toward the sea, but she had made it cozy over the years, filling it with soft blankets and warm lamplight and pottery of her own making. The building creaked gently as she climbed the narrow stairs, the old wooden steps worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The sound was familiar and comforting, part of the symphony of small noises that made up her daily life. The tick of the radiator warming up, the distant clink of Mr. Henderson closing up the hardware store below, the soft whisper of wind through the gaps in the old window frames. Her apartment welcomed her with the particular warmth of a space that has been loved and tended over time. She had painted the walls a soft cream color that caught the evening light beautifully, and hung curtains in a faded rose pattern that her mother had made years ago, before her hands became too unsteady for such delicate work. On the walls were photographs and small paintings collected from local artists, and on every available surface sat pottery, her own creations, but also pieces she had gathered from other craftspeople over the years, each one speaking to her in some way about beauty and form and the human need to make meaningful objects. She climbed the narrow stairs slowly, her body tired from the long day's work, but her mind still turning over the puzzle Margaret had presented. Who was this friend Margaret wanted her to meet? What secrets might be hidden in the old property records? And what could Thomas possibly hope to gain from buying the building where she had built her life? The questions swirled through her thoughts like autumn leaves caught in a gentle wind, but she did not try to catch them, did not try to force them into order. Instead, she let them drift and settle as she prepared for bed, washing her face in the small bathroom with its claw-foot tub, brushing her hair before the oval mirror that had belonged to her grandmother, changing into the soft flannel pajamas that felt like a warm embrace against her skin. She made herself a cup of warm milk with honey and carried it to the window seat in her bedroom, where she could look out at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The night was quiet, peaceful, the kind of night that seemed to hold the world in gentle hands and whisper that all would be well, that morning would come, that hope was never truly lost. Eleanor sipped her milk and let the warmth spread through her chest, let the peace of the evening settle around her like a soft blanket. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own questions and uncertainties, but tonight, right now, she was safe and warm and alive, and that was enough. She finished her milk and set the cup aside, then climbed into her bed with its patchwork quilt made from scraps of her mother's old dresses. The sheets were cool at first, then warm as her body heat filled the space around her, and she lay there for a long moment, feeling her breath slow and her muscles release, feeling the day's tensions begin to dissolve into the soft darkness. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was the moon rising over the harbor, round and silver and serene, casting its gentle light across the water like a blessing, like a promise that even in the darkest nights there was always light to guide the way home. The morning came soft and gray, with mist hanging low over the harbor and the smell of rain in the air. Eleanor woke slowly, drifting up from dreams she could not quite remember, and lay for a moment listening to the gentle sounds of the town coming to life. The distant clatter of the fishing boats, the first bells from the church on the hill, the quiet murmur of voices from the street below. She made herself tea and toast, eating slowly by the window while she watched the mist begin to lift and the first pale rays of sunlight break through the clouds. There was something peaceful about these morning hours, something sacred in the way the world seemed to pause and breathe before the business of the day began. At 9 o'clock, as Margaret had instructed, Eleanor walked to the bookshop next door to her studio. The old wooden sign above the door read Whitmore and Chen Books in faded gold letters, and the windows were filled with displays of leather-bound classics and hand-lettered recommendations, the kind of careful curation that spoke of genuine love for the written word. Margaret was waiting inside, standing beside a woman Eleanor had never seen before. The stranger was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair cut short and practical, and kind gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple linen dress the color of sea foam and had the sort of calm, competent presence that made Eleanor feel immediately at ease. "Eleanor, this is my dear friend Iris Wellwood," Margaret said, gesturing for Eleanor to come closer. "We've known each other since we were girls, if you can believe it. Iris has recently returned to Brackenshore after many years away, and when I told her about our situation with the building, she was very interested to hear more." Iris extended her hand, and her grip was warm and firm. "It's lovely to meet you, Eleanor. Margaret has told me so much about your pottery, and I've been admiring your work through the window for weeks now. You have a real gift." "Thank you," Eleanor said, feeling a slight flush of pleasure at the compliment. "Margaret mentioned that you might be able to help us understand what's happening with the property records." Iris nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps. You see, I spent most of my career working in property, law, specializing in historical title research. When Margaret told me about the irregularities she'd discovered in the records for your building, I was intrigued. I did some digging of my own, and I believe I found something significant." She reached into a leather satchel at her feet and withdrew a manila folder thick with papers. "This building, the one that houses your studio and Margaret's bookshop and the bakery next door, it has quite a complicated history. It was built in 1892 by a man named Cornelius Whitmore, who operated a general store here for many decades." "Whitmore?" Eleanor repeated, glancing at Margaret. "Like the bookshop." Margaret smiled gently. "My late husband's family. George was descended from Cornelius, though the connection was distant. The bookshop name is a tribute to that history." Iris continued, spreading several documents across the counter. "When Cornelius died in 1943, he left the building to his daughter Rosemary. But Rosemary never officially recorded the inheritance with the county. She simply continued to operate the general store, and later, when she retired, she rented out the spaces to other businesses. The building passed through several informal arrangements over the decades, never properly documented." Eleanor leaned closer to look at the papers, trying to follow the tangled lines of names and dates. "I don't understand. If the ownership was never properly recorded, how could anyone buy it? How could Thomas's company purchase something that was never officially for sale?" Iris looked at her with those calm, knowing eyes. "That's precisely the question, isn't it? According to my research, the last person with a legitimate claim to this building was Rosemary's granddaughter. But the company that sold to Coastal Development Partners wasn't her at all. It was a different entity entirely, one that appears to have no valid connection to the original ownership." "Are you saying," Eleanor said slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster, "that the sale was fraudulent? That Thomas doesn't actually own the building?" "I'm saying that the chain of title is broken," Iris replied carefully. "There are gaps in the records, transfers that were never properly executed, claims that may not hold up under scrutiny. Whether this constitutes fraud depends on what Thomas knew when he made the purchase and what his intentions were, but at the very least, it raises serious questions about the validity of the sale." Eleanor sat down heavily on one of Margaret's reading chairs, her mind reeling. All this time, she had assumed that Thomas's purchase was legitimate, that she had no recourse but to accept her fate and start over somewhere new. But if what Iris was saying was true, if the ownership of the building was genuinely in question, then perhaps there was still hope. "What should we do?" she asked, looking between the two older women. "Is there some kind of legal process we can pursue?" Iris nodded, thoughtfully. "There is, but it would require finding Rosemary's granddaughter, the person who may have the strongest legitimate claim to the property. If she were willing to come forward and assert her rights, it could potentially invalidate the sale and force Thomas's company to return the building to its rightful owner." "Do you know who she is?" Eleanor asked. "Do you know where to find her?" Iris was quiet for a moment, exchanging a glance with Margaret that Eleanor could not quite interpret. Then she smiled, a small soft smile that seemed to hold depths of meaning Eleanor did not yet understand. "I do, actually," Iris said gently. "You see, Eleanor, Rosemary Whitmore was my grandmother. This building, by rights, should belong to me." The words seemed to hang in the air for a long moment, shimmering like sunlight on water. Eleanor stared at Iris, trying to make sense of what she was hearing, trying to understand how all these threads, the building, the mysterious property records, Margaret's old friend returning to town, could weave together into something so unexpected, so perfectly aligned. There was a long silence in the room. Margaret's old clock ticked softly on the mantel. Outside, Eleanor could hear the faint sound of the harbor, boats creaking at their moorings, seagulls calling their eternal songs, the gentle lap of water against the wooden docks. The world continued its ordinary business, unaware of the extraordinary revelation that had just occurred in this small bookshop. Iris sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for Eleanor to process what she had just heard. Her expression was calm, patient, understanding. The expression of someone who had long ago made peace with the complications of her own story, and was simply waiting to see how others would receive it. "You?" Eleanor breathed finally. "But why didn't you say something sooner? Why didn't you claim the building years ago?" Iris sighed softly, settling into the chair beside Eleanor's. "Because I didn't know. I left Brackenshore when I was young, following my career, and I never looked back. My grandmother and I were not close. There was a falling out in the family, old wounds that never quite healed. When she died, I didn't attend the funeral. I didn't know anything about the building or the property or the complicated inheritance she had left behind." She paused, her eyes growing distant with memory. "It was only when I retired last year and decided to return to Brackenshore that I began to look into my family's history. I wanted to understand where I came from, to make peace with the past before I reached the end of my own story. And that's when I discovered the truth about this building and about what had happened to it." "And what has happened to it?" Eleanor asked quietly. Iris looked at her with an expression of gentle sorrow. "Someone took advantage of the broken chain of title. Someone saw an opportunity to claim property that wasn't theirs to claim, and they created false documents to make it appear legitimate. I don't know if Thomas Blackwood was aware of this when he purchased the building, or if he was simply the final link in a chain of deception that stretches back many years. But either way, the sale was built on a foundation of fraud." Margaret reached out and took Eleanor's hand, her grip steady and reassuring. "Iris came to me last week, after she discovered all of this. She was trying to decide what to do, whether to pursue her claim or simply let the past rest. And then I told her about you, about the letter you received, about what Thomas was trying to do. And she made her decision." Iris nodded slowly. "I've spent my whole career helping people untangle property disputes, helping families reclaim what was rightfully theirs. And now, it seems, it's time to do the same for myself, and for you, and for Margaret, and for everyone else who has built their lives in this little corner of Brackenshore." Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from something else. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude, or the overwhelming sense of being seen and supported in a moment of great need. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice slightly unsteady. "Now," Iris said, "we gather our evidence and present our case. I'll need to file a claim with the county, asserting my rights as Rosemary's heir. There will be hearings, examinations of the documents, probably some resistance from Thomas's lawyers. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, but I believe we have a strong case." She reached out and touched Eleanor's arm gently. "And in the meantime, I want you to keep doing what you do. Keep making your beautiful pottery. Keep serving your customers. Keep living your life in the studio you've built with your own hands. Don't let Thomas's deadline pressure you into making decisions before you're ready. The lease termination notice may not be valid if the sale itself was fraudulent." Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling something loosen in her chest, some knot of fear and worry that had been tightening for weeks. It wasn't over, she knew. There were still challenges ahead, uncertainties and obstacles she couldn't yet foresee. But she was no longer facing them alone, and that made all the difference. "Thank you," she said, looking at both women with genuine warmth. "I don't know how to express what this means to me." Margaret smiled and squeezed her hand. "You don't need to express it, dear. Just let yourself receive it. That's what community is for, to hold each other up when the weight becomes too heavy to carry alone." The three women sat together in the quiet bookshop for a while longer, talking through the details of what would come next, making plans and contingencies and promises of mutual support. Outside, the morning had brightened, the mist burning away to reveal a sky of soft, clear blue, and the harbor sparkled with reflected light like a field of scattered diamonds. When Eleanor finally returned to her studio, she felt different somehow. Lighter, more grounded, more certain that whatever happened, she would find her way through. She opened her door and stepped inside, and the familiar smell of clay and lavender wrapped around her like a welcoming embrace. She spent the rest of the day at her wheel, shaping and smoothing and creating, letting her hands do the work while her mind processed everything she had learned. And as the hours passed and the afternoon light softened into evening gold, She found herself thinking about all the unlikely connections that had brought her to this moment. Margaret's friendship, Iris's return, the tangled history of a building that had stood on this corner for more than a century. Perhaps, she thought, there was a kind of pattern to it all, a thread running through time that connected the past to the present, that wove together the lives of people who had never met but were somehow bound together by place, by story, by the simple human need for shelter and community and home. The weeks that followed moved with the unhurried rhythm of autumn turning toward winter. The maple trees along the harbor road shed their leaves in gentle cascades of gold and copper, and the mornings grew colder, marked by frost on the window panes and the soft, visible clouds of breath in the early air. Eleanor moved through her days with a new sense of purpose, creating her pottery by morning and spending her afternoons learning about the legal process that would determine the fate of her beloved studio. Iris had filed her claim with the county, and the response from Thomas's lawyers had been swift and aggressive. They disputed her evidence, challenged her standing, demanded documentation that proved her connection to Rosemary Whitmore. But Iris had spent her career preparing for exactly this kind of battle, and she met each challenge with calm competence, producing records and affidavits and carefully reasoned legal arguments that slowly, steadily built her case. Thomas himself had not appeared in any of the proceedings, but Eleanor could feel his presence behind every motion and objection, every delay and obstruction. She wondered sometimes what he was thinking, whether he regretted what he had set in motion, whether he had truly understood the harm he would cause when he decided to target the building where she had rebuilt her life. But she tried not to dwell too much on Thomas, tried not to let bitterness take root in her heart. She had learned, over these years of healing, that anger and resentment were like weeds in a garden. If left untended, they would spread and choke out everything beautiful. So instead, she focused on what she could control: her work, her relationships, the small daily choices that shaped the texture of her life. She made pottery. She shared meals with Margaret and Iris. She walked along the harbor at sunset, watching the fishing boats return, and the lighthouse begin its patient, rhythmic blinking. She read books borrowed from Margaret's shop, stories of adventure and romance and quiet domestic contentment. She talked with her customers, learned their stories, crafted pieces especially for their celebrations and milestones. And slowly, without her quite noticing it happening, her circle of connection began to expand. The Hendersons at the bakery, who faced the same uncertainty about their lease, became regular visitors to her studio, bringing fresh pastries and warm conversation. Old Mr. Whitmore, who ran the hardware store below her apartment, began stopping by to share his memories of Brackenshore's history, his gentle voice painting pictures of a town that had changed in many ways but remained, at its heart, the same. Other shop owners from the street began to take interest in the case, understanding that what happened to Marlow Ceramics might one day happen to them. They formed an informal alliance, meeting weekly at Margaret's bookshop to share information and offer support, their different businesses and backgrounds united by a common love for the community they had built together. These meetings became something Eleanor looked forward to all week, a chance to connect with people who understood what she was going through, who shared her values and her concerns, who reminded her that she was part of something larger than herself. They discussed strategy, yes, sharing what they had learned about property law and tenant rights and the various legal mechanisms that might help them protect their businesses, but they also shared meals and stories and the small daily details of their lives, building the kind of deep, sustaining friendships that can only grow from shared struggle and mutual support. Eleanor found herself particularly close to Sarah Henderson, the baker's wife, who had her own story of starting over after difficulty, a first marriage that had ended badly, a move across the country to escape painful memories, the slow rebuilding of a life in this small coastal town. They would sometimes stay late after the meetings, talking quietly in the lamplight while Margaret puttered around shelving books, sharing the kind of vulnerable truths that only come out between people who have learned to trust each other completely. These friendships changed something in Eleanor, softened some hard protective shell she had built around herself during the lonely years after her divorce. She had been so focused on surviving, on proving she could make it on her own, that she had forgotten how to let people in, how to accept help and comfort without feeling like a failure. The crisis with the building had forced her to reach out, to ask for support. And in doing so, she had discovered that vulnerability was not weakness. It was the door through which connection and love could enter. It was during one of these gatherings, on a particularly cold November evening when rain lashed the Windows and the wind howled through the harbor like a lonely ghost that Eleanor first met Daniel Reeves. He arrived with Iris, a tall man in his late 40s with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor, introduced as a retired journalist who had once covered business fraud for a regional newspaper. He had heard about the case through a mutual friend, Iris explained, and had offered to help investigate the background of the companies involved in the suspicious property transactions. There was something immediately trustworthy about Daniel, Eleanor thought as she shook his hand. It was in the way he held himself, not trying to take up too much space, not trying to impress or dominate, just present and attentive and real. His handshake was warm and firm, and his eyes met hers with a directness that felt respectful rather than challenging. She would learn later about his own story, the career that had burned him out, the divorce that had left him adrift, the years of searching for a new purpose. But in that first moment, all she knew was that he seemed like someone she could trust, someone who might understand the weight of what she was carrying without requiring her to explain it in words. The room had grown quieter as Daniel spread his documents across the counter, the other shop owners leaning in to see what he had brought. Rain streaked down the windows, and the lamplight cast warm shadows across the faces gathered around him. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a collective holding of breath as they waited to hear what he had discovered. "I've done some preliminary research," Daniel said, spreading a folder of documents across Margaret's counter. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that seemed designed for delivering difficult truths with gentleness. "And I've found some troubling patterns. Coastal Development Partners isn't the only shell company Thomas Blackwood has created. There are at least 3 others, all formed in the past 5 years, all involved in similar property acquisitions in small coastal towns." Eleanor leaned forward, studying the documents with growing unease. "Are you saying this has happened before? That Thomas has done this to other businesses, other communities?" Daniel nodded slowly. "It appears so. The pattern is consistent. He identifies buildings with unclear title histories, creates shell companies to obscure his involvement, and purchases the properties at below-market rates from sellers who may not have legitimate ownership. Then he either flips the buildings for profit or develops them into luxury condominiums that displace the existing tenants." "But that's fraud," Margaret said, her voice sharp with indignation. "How has he gotten away with it?" "Because proving fraud requires demonstrating intent," Daniel explained. "And Thomas has been careful to maintain plausible deniability. He uses intermediaries, creates paper trails that obscure his direct involvement, and counts on the fact that small business owners in these communities often lack the resources to fight back." He looked at Eleanor with something like admiration in his eyes. "What's happening here? With Iris's claim and your willingness to challenge the sale? It's unusual. Most people in similar situations simply give up and move on. The fact that you're standing your ground could make a real difference, not just for your own business, but for others who might be targeted in the future." Eleanor felt a flush of warmth at his words, mixed with a growing sense of determination. She had started this fight simply to save her own studio, to preserve the sanctuary she had built in the aftermath of her divorce. But now she was beginning to see it as something larger, something that connected her to people and communities she had never known, something that gave her struggle a meaning beyond her own small corner of the world. "What else can we do?" she asked. "Is there more evidence we should be gathering?" Daniel considered the question carefully. The strongest evidence would be testimony from someone inside Thomas's operation, someone who knows the details of how these transactions were structured, who can speak to his knowledge of the fraudulent title histories. Without that kind of direct evidence, it's difficult to prove that he knew what he was doing was wrong. "And I suppose there's no chance of finding someone like that," Margaret said with a sigh. But Daniel was looking at Eleanor with an expression she could not quite read. "Actually," he said slowly, "there might be. My research turned up the name of Thomas's former business partner, a woman named Catherine Mills. She left the company 2 years ago under unclear circumstances, and she's been living quietly in a town about 2 hours north of here ever since." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I reached out to her, explained what was happening, asked if she might be willing to talk. She was hesitant at first, clearly afraid of something. But when I mentioned your name, Eleanor, something changed. She said she remembered you from when you were married to Thomas. She said you were always kind to her, even when things were difficult." Eleanor's memory stirred, pulling up images from a past she had tried to leave behind. Catherine Mills. Yes, she remembered her now. A quiet woman who had worked with Thomas in those early years, who had seemed uncomfortable at the elegant dinner parties Thomas insisted on hosting, who had once confided to Eleanor that she was worried about some of the business practices she was witnessing. "She wants to talk to me?" Eleanor asked softly. Daniel nodded. "She said she would meet with you, privately, if you were willing to make the trip. She has information she's been carrying for a long time, afraid to share because she didn't know who she could trust. But she trusts you, Eleanor, and she's ready to tell her story." The room was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the rain drumming against the windows and the soft tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Eleanor looked around at the faces of her friends, Margaret's wise, encouraging smile, Iris's calm, steady gaze, Daniel's patient, hopeful expression, and she felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. This was it, she realized. This was the turning point she had been waiting for, though she had not known what shape it would take. If Catherine Mills was willing to share what she knew, it could change everything. It could bring Thomas's schemes into the light. It could not only save her studio, but protect other communities from the same predatory tactics. But it would also mean confronting the past she had worked so hard to leave behind. It would mean reopening wounds she had thought were healed, revisiting a marriage that had left her scarred and uncertain and afraid. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "If Catherine is willing to talk, I want to hear what she has to say." Margaret reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. "You won't be alone, dear. We'll be with you every step of the way." The drive north took Eleanor through countryside that had turned brown and dormant with the approach of winter, past farms with bare-branched orchards and fields of withered corn stalks bowing in the cold wind. Daniel drove, his hands steady on the wheel, while Eleanor sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape scroll past, her thoughts drifting through the years like fallen leaves. The road wound through small towns and villages, each one with its own character. A white-steepled church here, a general store with faded signs there, a farmhouse with smoke curling from its chimney and children's toys scattered across the frozen lawn. Eleanor watched it all pass by with a feeling of peaceful detachment, as if she were traveling not just through space, but through time, moving backward and forward simultaneously through all the versions of herself she had been and might yet become. The car was warm and quiet, the heater humming softly, the radio playing something classical at a low volume, a piano piece that seemed to match the gray, contemplative mood of the day. Daniel did not press her to talk, seemed to understand that she needed this time to gather her thoughts, to prepare herself for whatever might come next. She thought about Catherine Mills, about the quiet woman she remembered from those difficult final years of her marriage. She thought about Thomas, about the man he had been when she first fell in love with him, charming, ambitious, seemingly confident in a way that had made her feel safe. She thought about how gradually that confidence had curdled into something harder, something that could not tolerate disagreement or independence, something that needed to control and diminish and possess. She thought about her pottery, about the studio she had built with her, mother's inheritance, and her own two hands. She thought about how Thomas had dismissed her dreams, how he had made her feel small and foolish for wanting something more than the practical, profitable life he envisioned for them both. And she thought about how, in the end, his dismissal had been a kind of gift, a push that had forced her to discover who she really was, what she really valued, what she really needed to be whole. The town where Catherine lived was small and quiet, nestled in a valley between rolling hills that would be green with spring grass in a few months, but were now brown and sleeping. Daniel parked in front of a modest house with a white picket fence and a garden that, even in winter, showed signs of careful tending. "I'll wait here," he said gently. "Take as long as you need." Eleanor nodded and climbed out of the car, her heart beating fast as she walked up the stone path to the front door. The door opened before she reached it, and there was Catherine. Older now, her dark hair streaked with gray, but with the same gentle, worried eyes Eleanor remembered from years ago. "Eleanor," Catherine said softly, "thank you for coming. Please, come in." The house was warm and comfortable, filled with soft light from lamps scattered throughout the rooms and the gentle scent of something baking in the kitchen. Catherine led her to a small sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth, and 2 cups of tea waited on a tray, as if Eleanor's arrival had been anticipated and prepared for. The room was cozy in the particular way of spaces that have been loved and lived in for many years. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with well-worn paperbacks and family photographs in simple frames. A hand-knitted throw draped over the back of the sofa, and a cat dozed on the windowsill, its orange fur catching the firelight. Everything about the space spoke of a life lived quietly and carefully, of a woman who had found peace after turmoil. Catherine herself seemed different from how Eleanor remembered her. Calmer, more settled, as if the years away from Thomas's sphere of influence had allowed her to become more fully herself. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of both worry and laughter, and a gentleness in her manner that made Eleanor feel immediately at ease. They sat facing each other in worn but comfortable chairs, the fire popping softly between them, and Catherine began to pour the tea with hands that trembled slightly, from age, perhaps, or from the weight of what she was about to share. "I've thought about reaching out so many times," Catherine said, her voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I wanted to warn you about what Thomas was doing. I wanted to tell someone, but I was afraid. He made it very clear when I left the company what would happen if I talked." "What did he threaten?" Eleanor asked gently. Catherine shook her head slowly. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that I'm ready to tell the truth. I've been carrying this weight for so long, and it's exhausted me. I need to set it down, regardless of the consequences." She took a deep breath, her hands wrapped around her teacup, as if drawing warmth and strength from it. Thomas knew. From the very beginning, he knew that the properties he was acquiring had questionable titles. He sought them out deliberately, looking for buildings where the ownership records were confused or incomplete, where he could exploit the gaps to acquire valuable real estate at a fraction of its worth. Eleanor listened as Catherine explained the details, the intermediaries Thomas used to obscure his involvement, the lawyers he employed to create false documentation, the pattern of targeting small communities where people were less likely to have the resources to fight back. It was all laid out systematically, meticulously, the product of years of careful observation by someone who had been close to the center of Thomas's operations. "I have records," Catherine said finally. "Copies of documents, emails, financial transactions. I made copies of everything I could before I left, because I knew that someday someone would need to hold him accountable." She rose and walked to a bookshelf in the corner of the room, pulling out a thick manila folder that had been hidden behind a row of novels. "This is everything I have. It's enough to prove that Thomas knew exactly what he was doing. It's enough to stop him." Eleanor took the folder with trembling hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight of paper, but the weight of justice delayed, of truth finally coming to light, of a path forward that had seemed impossible just a few hours ago. "Why me?" she asked softly. "Why did you trust me enough to share this?" Catherine smiled sadly. "Because you were always different from him. Even when you were married, I could see it. The way you treated people, the kindness in your eyes, the way you seemed uncomfortable with the world he was building around you. I always hoped you would find your way out. And when Daniel told me what he was trying to do to your studio, I knew it was time. I couldn't let him hurt you again." Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks, hot and cleansing, releasing something she had held inside for a very long time. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth." Catherine reached out and took her hand, her grip warm and steady. "Thank you for giving me a reason to finally let go." They sat together for a long while, two women who had both suffered from Thomas's need for control, both found their way to freedom, both discovered that healing sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the winter light outside the windows grew dim as afternoon faded into evening. When Eleanor finally returned to the car where Daniel waited, she carried the folder of evidence against her chest like a treasure, like a key that would unlock a door she had feared was permanently closed. "She gave me everything," Eleanor said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "Everything we need to prove what Thomas has done." Daniel looked at her with quiet respect. "Then it's almost over. Once this evidence is submitted to the court, once the fraud is exposed, Thomas won't be able to hide behind his shell companies anymore. The building will be returned to Iris, and you can stay in your studio for as long as you want." Eleanor nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion and something else, something that might have been hope or gratitude, or simply the profound peace of knowing that justice, though delayed, was finally within reach. They drove back to Brackenshore as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Eleanor watched them through the window, thinking about all the people who had come together to make this moment possible. Margaret with her wisdom and connections, Iris with her legal expertise and her willingness to claim what was rightfully hers, Daniel with his research skills and his quiet dedication to uncovering the truth, Catherine with her courage in finally speaking up after years of silence. The road unwound before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkening countryside. Here and there, farmhouses glowed with warm light, small islands of human habitation in the vast darkness of the rural landscape. Eleanor found herself thinking about all the people in those houses. Families gathered around dinner tables, children doing homework by lamplight, couples settling into evening routines they had practiced for years. Each house held its own story, its own collection of hopes and fears and daily struggles. And yet they were all connected, all part of the larger story of human beings trying to build lives of meaning and purpose, trying to find their place in a world that often seemed indifferent to their efforts. The thought brought her a strange comfort. She was not alone in her struggles, not unique in her fears or her hopes. She was part of this vast, interconnected web of human life, and her story, her small victory against someone who had tried to take what was hers, was part of a larger pattern, a larger movement toward justice and healing that stretched back through history and forward into a future she could not see. And herself, she realized. Her own persistence, her own refusal to simply give up and walk away had been part of it too. She had learned, in these weeks of struggle and uncertainty, that she was stronger than she had known, more capable of standing her ground than she had ever believed possible. The town of Brackenshore appeared on the horizon, its lights twinkling warmly in the darkness like a constellation brought down to earth. Eleanor felt her heart swell with love for this place, for its cobblestone streets and harbor full of fishing boats, for its weathered shops and friendly faces, for the studio where she had rebuilt her life from the broken pieces of her past. She was home. The legal proceedings moved more swiftly than anyone had expected. Catherine's evidence was damning, and Thomas's lawyers found themselves unable to construct a credible defense against such detailed documentation. The court scheduled a hearing for early December, just 3 weeks before Eleanor's lease was originally set to expire. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was fuller than Eleanor had anticipated. Word had spread through the community about what was happening, and shop owners from up and down the main street had come to show their support. The Hendersons from the bakery sat in the front row, along with Margaret and Iris and Daniel and dozens of others Eleanor had come to know over the years of building her business in Brackenshore. The room had that particular hush that courtrooms always seem to have, a heavy silence that speaks of weighty decisions and lives hanging in the balance. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wooden floor, and motes of dust drifted lazily in the beams like small stars floating in slow motion. Eleanor sat in one of the spectator benches, flanked by Margaret on one side and Daniel on the other. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her heart beating steadily, her mind strangely calm. Whatever happened in this room today, she had already won something important. She had discovered that she was not alone, that there were people who would stand beside her when times were hard, that the community she had found in Brackenshore was real and strong and enduring. She looked around at the faces of her supporters, the Hendersons, who had known their own fear of losing their bakery, old Mr. Whitmore, whose hardware store had been part of this street for 40 years, the young couple who ran the cafe on the corner, the artists and craftspeople and small business owners who understood, as she did, that what they had built together was worth fighting for. Thomas was there too, sitting at the defendant's table with his lawyers, looking smaller somehow than Eleanor remembered, diminished by the weight of exposure. He did not meet her eyes as she walked past, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw, and she felt, not triumph, exactly, but something closer to compassion. He had done wrong, she knew. He had hurt people, exploited communities, built his success on the foundation of other people's losses. But he was also a man who had somehow lost his way, who had let his ambition and his pride lead him into darkness, who had never learned the lesson Eleanor had learned so painfully over these past years, that true success is measured not in properties acquired or profits earned, but in relationships nurtured, in communities strengthened, in the quiet satisfaction of work done with integrity and love. She hoped, in some distant corner of her heart, that this experience might be a turning point for him too, that perhaps in facing the consequences of his actions, he might find a path towards something better. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. The evidence was presented, the arguments were made, and the judge, a wise-looking woman with silver hair and compassionate eyes, took only a short recess before returning with her decision. The sale of the building was declared invalid. Iris Wellwood was recognized as the rightful heir to her grandmother's property. Coastal Development Partners was ordered to return all documents and relinquish any claims to the building and its contents. And Thomas Blackwood, the managing partner of the fraudulent company, was referred to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal charges related to property fraud and the creation of false documents. Eleanor sat in the courtroom as the words washed over her, feeling something crack open in her chest, some last remaining wall of fear and uncertainty that had surrounded her heart for so long. It was over. She was safe. Her studio, her sanctuary, her life's work would remain exactly where it belonged. The relief was so profound that for a moment she could not move, could not speak, could only sit there letting the reality sink in. All those weeks of worry, all those sleepless nights, all those moments when despair had threatened to overwhelm her, they had led to this, to victory, to freedom, to the right to continue living the life she had fought so hard to build. She thought about her mother, who had given her the inheritance that made the studio possible. She thought about all the customers who had walked through her door over the years, who had taken pieces of her pottery into their homes and their lives. She thought about Margaret and Iris and Daniel and Catherine and all the others who had stood beside her during this crisis, who had believed in her when she struggled to believe in herself. She thought about the clay, the simple, humble material that had become her medium, her teacher, her path back to wholeness. How many pounds of it had she shaped over these years? How many vessels had she created, each one a small act of hope, a small statement of faith that beauty was possible, that meaning could be found, that ordinary things could be transformed into something extraordinary? Around her, the people of Brackenshore erupted in quiet celebration, hugs and handshakes and tears of relief and joy. Margaret embraced her tightly, whispering words of congratulation and love. Iris smiled with a deep satisfaction of someone who had reclaimed not just property, but a piece of her own history. Daniel squeezed her shoulder gently, his eyes warm with admiration for all she had endured, and Eleanor stood among them, surrounded by the community that had rallied around her in her moment of need, and she understood, perhaps for the first time fully understood, that she had never really been alone. Even in the darkest moments, even when despair had seemed to close around her like a suffocating fog, there had been hands reaching out to help her, hearts opened in compassion, a web of connection and support that had held her up when she could not hold herself. The days that followed the hearing were filled with celebration and renewal. Iris decided to officially transfer ownership of the building to a community trust, ensuring that the shops and studios it housed would be protected from predatory acquisition forever. The Hendersons' bakery, Margaret's bookshop, and Eleanor's pottery studio would remain in their places for as long as they chose to stay. To mark the occasion, Iris organized a small gathering at Margaret's bookshop on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, when the darkness reaches its peak and then begins slowly, almost imperceptibly, to give way to returning light. The shop was decorated with candles and evergreen boughs, and the air was fragrant with mulled cider and the warmth of bodies gathered together in celebration. Fairy lights had been strung along the bookshelves, casting the room in a soft, twinkling glow that made everything look magical, like something out of a storybook or a half-remembered dream. People filled every corner of the shop, the faithful customers who had supported these businesses for years, the neighbors who had rallied together during the crisis, the friends old and new who had become, over these months of struggle and triumph, something closer to family. They laughed and talked and shared stories, raising glasses and toasts to the new year ahead, to the community that had held them all together, to the simple miracle of being alive and connected in a world that often felt cold and isolating. Eleanor moved through the room, accepting congratulations and sharing her gratitude, feeling lighter than she had in years, perhaps lighter than she had ever felt. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear of losing her studio, the pain of her failed marriage, the deep loneliness of those years of rebuilding, all of it seemed to have lifted, carried away by the warmth of these friendships, by the security of knowing her place in this community was finally truly safe. She found herself eventually by the window, looking out at the harbor where the lights of the fishing boats reflected on the dark water like scattered stars. The moon was rising over the distant point, full and silver and serene, casting its gentle blessing over the town she had come to love so deeply. Daniel appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of cider. He offered one to her, and she took it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic mug. One of her own creations, she noticed, the blue-green glaze that reminded her of the sea. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question, searching inside herself for an honest answer. "Grateful," she said, finally, and tired, and ready for whatever comes next. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes warm in the candlelight. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next for me, too. This investigation, this community, you, it's reminded me of things I'd forgotten, about what matters, about where I want to put my energy and my time." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've decided to stay in Brackenshore, at least for a while. There's a small cottage for rent near the lighthouse, and I think I'd like to try my hand at writing something other than exposés of fraud. Maybe a book about communities like this one, places that resist the pressure to change, that hold on to their character and their values in the face of everything trying to push them away." Eleanor felt her heart lift at his words. She had not realized, until that moment, how much she had been hoping he would stay. Their friendship had become so important to her over these past months. The easy conversations, the shared meals, the sense of being understood by someone who had walked through his own fires and emerged, like her, somewhat scarred, but still capable of hope. "That sounds wonderful," she said, and meant it. "Brackenshore has so many stories waiting to be told, and you're exactly the right person to tell them." Daniel smiled, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I was also hoping," he paused, suddenly almost shy, "that you might be willing to help me, show me the places and people I should know about, be my guide to this community you've become so much a part of." Eleanor smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the cider. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like that very much." The night deepened around them, soft and velvet dark, filled with the murmur of friendly voices and the gentle glow of candlelight. Outside, the first stars of winter sparkled in the clear, cold sky, and the harbor water moved in its eternal rhythm, lapping against the boats and the shore with the patient, ceaseless music of the sea. In Margaret's bookshop, surrounded by the people who had become her family, Eleanor felt the last traces of the old pain finally begin to dissolve, washed away by the healing tide of time and love and belonging. In the weeks that followed the winter solstice, Brackenshore settled into the gentle rhythms of the cold season. Snow fell softly over the harbor, blanketing the boats and the rooftops in white, muffling the sounds of the town into a peaceful quiet. The shops along the main street lit their windows with warm, golden light, and the smell of wood smoke mingled with the salt breeze from the sea. The town took on a particular beauty in winter, a quieter, more contemplative beauty than the vibrant colors of autumn or the lush abundance of summer. There was something sacred about these shortest days, these longest nights, when the world seemed to draw inward and rest, gathering its strength for the renewal that would come with spring. Eleanor found comfort in the winter routines, the ritual of lighting the wood stove each morning, the pleasure of warm soup for lunch, the quiet evenings spent reading by lamplight while snow fell softly outside the window. She had learned, over the years, to embrace the rhythms of the seasons rather than fighting against them, to find beauty and meaning in each phase of the year's turning. The winter also brought a particular intimacy to the community of Brackenshore. With fewer tourists and longer nights, the locals drew closer together, gathering more frequently for dinners and conversations and the simple pleasure of human company. Eleanor found herself invited to more potlucks and card games and impromptu tea parties than she could count, welcomed into homes and hearts that had opened to her during the difficult autumn months and remained open as winter settled in. She found herself working with renewed energy and purpose. The fear that had shadowed her for so many months had lifted, and in its place was a deep, settled peace, the peace of knowing that her place in this community was secure, that the work she loved could continue, that the sanctuary she had built would remain standing. She began a new series of pottery, inspired by the events of the past months. Vessels shaped like shelters, small houses and lighthouses and boats, glazed in the soft blues and greens of the winter sea. She called the collection Haven, and when she displayed the first pieces in her window, they sold almost immediately to customers who seemed to understand, without words, what she was trying to express. Daniel became a regular presence in her days, stopping by the studio each afternoon with stories from his research and questions about the town and its history. Their friendship deepened slowly, unhurried, like the gradual warming of spring after a long winter. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits, to the comfortable silences they shared, to the conversations that ranged from the philosophical to the mundane and back again. She learned about his past, the career that had burned him out, the divorce that had left him adrift, the years of wandering before he had found his way to Brackenshore. He learned about hers, the marriage that had diminished her, the grief that had broken her open, the slow, patient work of rebuilding that had made her who she was today. They were both, they discovered, people who had been through the fire and emerged transformed. They understood each other in ways that required no explanation, recognized in each other the particular kind of strength that comes from having survived. One afternoon, in late January, when the snow was falling heavily and the studio was warm and quiet, Daniel asked Eleanor if he could watch her work. She agreed, and he settled into the old armchair in the corner while she took her place at the wheel, centering a ball of clay with the practiced ease of years of experience. "I've been thinking," he said softly, "about what you told me, about how you started all this, how you came here after your mother died and your marriage ended, how you were looking for something to do with your grief." Eleanor nodded, her hands moving steadily as the clay rose beneath her fingers. "I didn't know what I was looking for at first. I just knew I needed to make something, to take something shapeless and give it form. It felt like the only way to make sense of everything that was happening." "And did it? Make sense of things?" Eleanor considered the question, watching the vessel take shape on the wheel, a simple bowl, round and open, waiting to hold whatever might be placed inside it. "Not exactly, but it taught me something important. It taught me that making sense of things isn't always the point. Sometimes the point is just to keep going, to keep shaping and creating, even when you don't understand why. And eventually, if you're patient enough, you look up and realize you've built something beautiful without quite meaning to." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching her work. Then he said, "I think that might be the wisest thing anyone has ever said to me." Eleanor smiled, lifting the finished bowl from the wheel and setting it aside to dry. "It took me a long time to learn it, and I'm still learning it, really, every day." She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him, meeting his eyes with a directness that felt new and slightly thrilling. "I'm glad you decided to stay in Brackenshore, Daniel. I'm glad you're here." "So am I," he said softly. "So am I." The winter slowly loosened its grip, giving way to the first tentative signs of spring. Crocuses pushed through the snow in the community garden, purple and yellow and white, and the harbor began to stir with activity as the fishing boats prepared for the new season. Eleanor opened the windows of her studio for the first time in months, letting the fresh, salt-tinged air sweep through and carry away the mustiness of the long winter. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, a slight lengthening of the days, a softening of the light, a whisper of warmth in the afternoon breeze. But then suddenly, as spring always seemed to do, it arrived all at once. The trees along the harbor road burst into bloom, their branches heavy with pink and white blossoms that drifted down like confetti whenever the wind blew. The gardens came alive with daffodils and tulips, and the air filled with the songs of returning birds. Eleanor felt something shift inside her as well, some final layer of the old pain melting away like the last patches of snow disappearing from the shaded corners of the harbor. It was as if the earth's renewal was mirroring her own, as if the same force that pushed the flowers up through the frozen ground was also pushing her forward into this new chapter of her life. She spent long hours in the community garden, tending the plot she had claimed the previous year, preparing the soil for the vegetables and herbs she would plant when the weather warmed further. There was something deeply satisfying about this work. The feel of soil beneath her fingers, the patient waiting for seeds to sprout, the slow miracle of growth unfolding day by day. It was not so different from pottery, she realized, this shaping of living things, this collaboration with forces greater than herself. Margaret celebrated her 73rd birthday with a party at the bookshop, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become, over these past months, even more tightly bound together by their shared experience. Iris announced that she had decided to stay in Brackenshore permanently, taking an apartment above the hardware store and beginning work on a memoir about her family's history and the journey that had led her back to this place. And one soft evening in early April, as the sun was setting over the harbor and the air was sweet with the scent of flowering fruit trees, Eleanor received a letter. It was from Thomas. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the precise, controlled letters that she had once known so well, and for a moment she felt the old fear stir in her chest. But it was different now, smaller and more distant, like the echo of a storm that has already passed. She opened the envelope and read, "Eleanor, I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know the harm I caused, to you, to others, to communities I never stopped to consider as anything more than opportunities for profit. I know that sorry is not enough, and that some things can never be truly repaired. But I wanted you to know that I am trying to understand. I am trying to see, for the first time, the damage I left behind me. The investigation is ongoing, and I expect to face consequences for what I did. I accept that. I think I need it, actually. Some kind of reckoning that forces me to confront what I became. I think about you sometimes, about the person you were when we first met. Kind and creative and full of light that I never quite knew how to appreciate. About the way I tried to dim that light because it made me uncomfortable, because it reminded me of things I had lost or never had. You deserved better than what I gave you. I know that now. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't think I've earned it. But I wanted you to know that seeing what you've built, the studio, the community, the life you've created, it has changed something in me. It has made me wonder if there might be another way to live. Whatever happens to me, I hope you continue to thrive. I hope you find everything you're looking for. I hope you know that your success is not revenge. It's simply the natural result of being exactly who you are. Thomas." Eleanor read the letter twice, then a third time, feeling emotions move through her that she could not quite name. There was sadness in there, and anger, and something that might have been the beginning of compassion. Thomas had hurt her deeply, had tried to take away the sanctuary she had built for herself, but he was also a man who was suffering, who was perhaps finally beginning to see the shape of his own brokenness. She sat with the letter for a long time, watching the evening light change outside her window, thinking about all the years she had spent trying to understand who Thomas was and why he had treated her the way he did. She had loved him once, or thought she had, loved the version of him that had existed in those early years, before ambition and pride had hardened into something colder, something that could not tolerate her independence or her dreams. She wondered sometimes if that original Thomas still existed somewhere inside him, buried beneath the layers of choices and compromises and small moral failures that had led him to become the man who would try to destroy her business out of spite. She wondered if the letter she held in her hands was a sign that he was beginning to find his way back to himself, or if it was simply another manipulation, another attempt to control how she thought about him. In the end, she decided it did not matter. She could not know what was truly in Thomas's heart, could not verify the sincerity of his words. All she could do was choose how she wanted to respond, not to him, necessarily, but to the situation, to the feelings his letter had stirred up in her. She chose compassion. Not forgiveness, exactly. That felt too large, too final, like something that could only come after much more time and healing. But compassion, yes. The recognition that Thomas was a human being who had caused harm and was now facing consequences, who might be suffering in ways she would never fully understand. She could hold space for that without excusing what he had done, without forgetting the pain he had caused. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer in her desk. She would not respond. There was nothing she needed to say, no reconciliation that felt right or necessary, but she would hold on to the letter, would let it remind her that people could change, could grow, could find their way toward light even after years of choosing darkness, and she would continue to live her life exactly as she had been living it, with kindness and creativity and the steady, patient work of shaping beauty from the raw material of ordinary days. The spring deepened into summer, and Brackenshore blossomed into its most beautiful season. The harbor sparkled under cloudless skies, and the gardens along the main street overflowed with roses and lavender and the cheerful chaos of wildflowers. Tourists arrived in greater numbers than ever, drawn by word of mouth about the charming coastal town with its artisan shops and friendly community. The summer light had a particular quality here, Eleanor had noticed over the years, softer than inland light, filtered through the salt haze from the sea, casting everything in a gentle golden glow that made even ordinary things look beautiful. The days stretched long and warm, filled with the sounds of children playing on the beach, the calls of seabirds circling overhead, the distant laughter of families enjoying their vacations. For Eleanor, summer meant longer hours in the studio, more visitors browsing her shelves, more conversations with people from faraway places who had found their way to this small corner of the world. She loved these interactions, loved hearing about the lives people led in cities and suburbs and countries she had never visited. Each customer brought with them a small piece of their world, and in exchange, they carried away a piece of hers. A mug or a bowl or a vase that would sit in their kitchen or their living room, reminding them of a sunny day in a coastal town where they had felt, even if only for a moment, completely at peace. Her pottery sold briskly, her Haven collection becoming particularly popular among visitors who seemed to sense the story behind the pieces, even without being told. Each vessel in the collection held something of Eleanor's journey, the shelter she had sought, the home she had found, the peace she had painstakingly constructed from the fragments of her broken life. People seemed to recognize this, seemed to feel it when they held the pieces in their hands, and they carried the pottery away like talismans, like small portable sanctuaries they could bring into their own lives. She hired an assistant, a young woman named Lily, who had recently graduated from art school and was eager to learn the craft. Together, they expanded the studio's offerings, adding workshops where visitors could try their hand at the wheel and classes for local children who wanted to explore their own creativity. Daniel finished the first draft of his book about communities like Brackenshore, places that had resisted the pressure to change, that had held onto their character and their values in the face of everything trying to push them away. He read portions of it aloud to Eleanor on quiet evenings in her apartment, and she listened with a full heart, recognizing her own town, her own story, in the words he had so carefully chosen. Their relationship had grown slowly over the spring and summer, ripening from friendship into something deeper, something that felt as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. They did not rush or push, did not try to force their connection into any particular shape. They simply allowed it to unfold at its own pace, trusting that whatever it became would be exactly what it was meant to be. There were long walks along the harbor at sunset, conversations that lasted until the stars came out, quiet afternoons in Eleanor's studio where Daniel would read while she worked at her wheel. There were dinners cooked together in one, kitchen or the other, bottles of wine shared over candlelight, laughter that came more easily as the weeks passed and they learned the contours of each other's hearts. Eleanor found that she was able to share things with Daniel that she had never shared with anyone, not just the facts of her history, but the feelings beneath them, the fears and hopes and secret dreams that she had kept locked away for so long. And he shared in return, opening himself to her with a vulnerability that touched her deeply, that made her feel trusted and valued in a way she had not felt in many years. They talked about the future sometimes, in careful, tentative ways, not making plans exactly, but exploring possibilities, imagining what life might look like as they continued to build it together. Neither of them was in a hurry to define what they were or where they were going. They had both learned, through hard experience, that life rarely followed the paths one expected, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came from simply staying present and allowing things to unfold. One evening in August, as they sat together on the balcony of Eleanor's apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Daniel took her hand gently in his. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said that day in your studio. About making sense of things not always being the point. About just keeping going, keeping creating, and eventually looking up to find you've built something beautiful." Eleanor nodded, remembering the conversation, feeling the truth of those words even more deeply now than she had when she first spoke them. "I think that's what this is," Daniel continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "What we've built, you and I, something beautiful that neither of us quite planned or expected, something that grew out of shared pain and shared healing and the simple willingness to be present with each other." He turned to face her, his eyes soft in the evening light. "I love you, Eleanor. I don't know exactly what the future holds, and I've learned not to make predictions about things I can't control, but I know that I want to keep building with you. I want to see what we become." Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of the particular kind of joy that comes from being seen and known and chosen by another person. She had spent so many years believing that she was meant to be alone, that her chance at partnership and love had passed her by. And now here was this man, this patient and kind and deeply good man, offering her something she had not dared to hope for. "I love you too," she said softly, "and I want to build with you. Whatever comes next, I want to face it together." Daniel leaned in and kissed her gently, and Eleanor felt something click into place inside her. Some final piece of a puzzle she had been working on for years, without quite knowing what the completed picture would look like. The harbor stretched out below them, peaceful and eternal, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The lighthouse on the distant point began its slow, rhythmic blinking, sending its beam of light out over the water as it had done for more than a century, guiding boats safely home. And Eleanor, sitting beside the man she loved, in the town that had become her sanctuary, felt the deep, settled peace of someone who has finally, after a long journey, arrived exactly where she belongs. The autumn came again, gentle and golden, painting the trees along the harbor road in the same warm colors that had greeted Eleanor 3 years before, when she had first received the letter threatening to upend her life. So much had changed since then, the fear replaced by security, the loneliness replaced by connection, the uncertainty replaced by a deep and settled peace. The turning of the seasons had always held a particular meaning for Eleanor, ever since those first difficult months after her divorce when she had learned to mark time by the small changes in the natural world. The first crocus pushing through the snow, the longest day of summer, the first leaves changing color in autumn. Each cycle reminded her that change was constant, that nothing stayed the same forever, that even the darkest seasons eventually gave way to light. This autumn felt different, though. It felt less like an ending and more like a culmination, like the final movement of a symphony that had been building through all the movements that came before. She could feel the wholeness of her life now, could see how all the pieces fit together, the pain and the joy, the losses and the gains, the moments of despair and the moments of profound grace. She had become, she realized, exactly who she was meant to be. Not perfect, certainly, still flawed, still learning, still struggling with the same fears and insecurities that had always been part of her nature, but authentic, real, true to herself in a way she had never quite managed to be when she was younger, when she was still trying to shape herself into what she thought others wanted her to be. She and Daniel had moved in together, taking a small house near the lighthouse with a garden that Eleanor filled with herbs and flowers and the scattered pottery pieces she made just for the joy of creating. Lily had become a skilled potter in her own right, capable of managing the studio independently when Eleanor wanted time away. Margaret and Iris continued their friendship, spending their evenings in the bookshop discussing literature and history and the mysterious ways that life sometimes circles back on itself. On a particularly beautiful October evening, when the air was crisp and clean and the sunset was spectacular over the water, Eleanor walked to her studio for what had become a beloved ritual. Each night before closing, she would spend a few minutes alone in the space, straightening shelves and sweeping floors, and simply being present with the work she had created. Tonight, as she moved through the familiar motions, she found herself thinking about all the hands that had shaped this moment. Her mother, whose inheritance had made the studio possible. Margaret, whose friendship had sustained her through the darkest times. Iris, whose return had saved the building from Thomas's schemes. Catherine, whose courage had provided the evidence needed for justice. Daniel, whose love had opened her heart to possibilities she had stopped believing in. And her own hands, she thought, looking down at them, roughened by years of working with clay, strong and capable and scarred in places where the work had demanded something from her. These hands had shaped thousands of vessels over the years, had given form to shapeless lumps of earth, had created beauty out of raw material and patient labor. They had also, she realized, shaped something larger. A life, a community, a story of healing and redemption and gentle justice that would ripple outward in ways she might never fully see or understand. She finished her closing ritual and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The main street was quiet now, the shops dark except for the soft glow of nightlights in their windows. The harbor stretched out peaceful and still, and the lighthouse was just beginning its nightly dance of light across the water. Eleanor stood for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the salt air fill her lungs and the peace of the evening settle around her like a soft blanket. She thought about Thomas, about the letter she had received from him over a year ago now, about the long road of consequences and perhaps redemption that stretched out before him. She hoped he was finding his way, hoped that something good might eventually grow from the ashes of all that destruction. She thought about herself, The woman she had been when she first came to Brackenshore, grieving and lost and afraid. And the woman she had become, standing here now, surrounded by everything she had built and everyone who loved her. The journey from there to here had been long and often difficult, but she would not have traded a single step of it, because every step had brought her closer to this moment. Every loss and every gain, every fear and every courage, every broken piece and every careful repair, all of it had been necessary to create the person she was now, standing in the quiet street of the town she loved, filled with a peace so deep and so complete that it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. She turned and began walking toward the house she shared with Daniel, toward the warm lights and the dinner waiting and the life they were building together. The stars were coming out overhead, scattered across the velvet sky like promises, like blessings, like the quiet assurance that even in the darkest nights there was always light to guide the way. And as she walked, Eleanor smiled, feeling the gentle rhythm of her footsteps on the cobblestones, feeling the cool air on her face and the love in her heart, feeling the deep, abiding certainty that whatever came next, she was ready, she was home. The night wrapped itself around Brackenshore like a soft, dark blanket, tucking the little town in for rest. Eleanor moved through the familiar streets with unhurried steps, her breath forming small clouds in the cool air, her heart full of the quiet contentment that comes from a day well lived and a life well shaped. She passed the bakery where the Hendersons were closing up for the night, saw Mr. Henderson wave to her through the window as he wiped down the counter where tomorrow's fresh bread would be displayed. She passed Margaret's bookshop, dark now but somehow still warm-looking, its windows full of books that held 1,000 different worlds within their pages. She passed her own studio, her sanctuary, her life's work made manifest in moss-green shutters and hand-painted signs, and shelves full of pottery that would soon find its way into homes across the country, carrying with it some small measure of the peace and beauty she had learned to shape from raw clay and patient hope. And she walked on, past the harbor where the boats rocked gently in the darkness, past the community garden where spring flowers slept beneath the earth waiting for warmth, past the lighthouse that sent its steady beam across the water, guiding travelers safely home. The house she shared with Daniel was warm and golden lit when she arrived, and she could see him through the window, moving around the kitchen, preparing something that smelled of garlic and herbs and comfort. She stood for a moment on the porch, just watching, just feeling the sweetness of this ordinary moment. A man cooking dinner, a house full of light. A love that had grown slowly and surely from the soil of shared understanding. Then she opened the door and stepped inside, into the warmth and the light and the life she had built for herself, and she let the peace of the evening settle around her like the softest of blankets, like the gentlest of embraces, like the quiet promise that all was well, and all would be well, and all manner of things would be well. Outside, the night continued its gentle descent over Brackenshore. The stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient patterns. The sea moved in its eternal rhythm against the shore, and somewhere in the darkness, the first owl began its quiet call, singing the town toward sleep. The fire in the hearth crackled softly as Eleanor and Daniel finished their dinner, the dishes cleared away, the wine glasses nearly empty. They sat together on the old sofa, Eleanor's head resting on Daniel's shoulder, watching the flames dance and flicker in patterns that seemed almost like stories being told in a language just beyond understanding. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said softly, "about how different everything looks from how I imagined it would be. When I was young, I had such specific ideas about what my life would become. The career, the marriage, the house, the children, and almost none of it turned out the way I planned." Daniel's arm tightened gently around her shoulders. "Do you wish it had turned out the way you planned?" Eleanor considered the question, watching the firelight play across the ceiling. "No," she said finally. "I don't think I do, because if everything had gone according to my plans, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have this studio, this town, this community. I wouldn't have you." She turned to look at him, her eyes soft in the dim light. "I think maybe our plans are like the first rough shape we give to a piece of clay. They're necessary, they give us something to start with, something to work toward, but the real beauty comes from what happens next, from the way the clay responds to our hands, from the unexpected curves and contours that emerge as we work, from the willingness to let go of what we thought we were making and embrace what we're actually creating. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "You're remarkable. Do you know that? The way you see the world, the way you find meaning in things. It's like you've discovered some secret language that most of us never learn." Eleanor smiled softly. "I haven't discovered anything. I've just been paying attention. And I've been lucky enough to have people in my life who taught me what to look for." They sat together as the fire burned lower, speaking sometimes, silent sometimes, simply present with each other in the intimate quiet of a shared home. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the trees and carrying the distant sound of the sea, that eternal, soothing rhythm that had sung Brackenshore to sleep for generations. When the fire had burned down to embers and the hour had grown late, they rose and moved through the house, turning off lights, checking doors, performing the small rituals that marked the transition from day to night. Eleanor paused by the window in the bedroom, looking out at the stars scattered across the sky like handfuls of silver seeds. "What do you think tomorrow will bring?" she asked, more to herself than to Daniel. He came to stand beside her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I don't know," he said, "but whatever it is, we'll face it together, and we'll shape it into something beautiful, the way you always do." Eleanor leaned back against him, feeling his warmth and his steadiness, feeling the deep peace of being held by someone who truly saw her, truly valued her, truly loved her exactly as she was. "Yes," she said softly, "we will." They climbed into bed together, pulling the soft quilts up around them, settling into the warmth and comfort of bodies close together in the darkness. Eleanor felt sleep begin to pull at the edges of her consciousness, that gentle, inexorable tide that carries us all away at the end of each day. But before she let it take her completely, she sent one last thought out into the universe. A prayer, or a blessing, or simply a quiet acknowledgement of gratitude for all she had received. "Thank you," she thought, "for the pain that taught me, for the love that healed me, for the community that held me, for the life I've been given to shape and to share. Thank you." And then she slept, deeply and peacefully, her breath mingling with Daniel's in the quiet room, her heart full of the particular contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you're meant to be. Outside, the night continued its gentle watch over Brackenshore. The lighthouse turned and turned, sending its faithful beam across the dark water. The stars wheeled slowly through the velvet sky, and the sea moved in its eternal rhythm, singing its ancient lullaby to the sleeping town. All was well, all was at peace, all was exactly as it should be, and in a small pottery studio on the main street, surrounded by vessels waiting to be filled with tea and flowers and the small daily rituals of ordinary lives, the clay rested quietly on its shelf, ready for the morning, ready to be shaped by patient hands into something new, something beautiful, something that would carry a piece of one woman's peace and healing out into the world. The night deepened, the town slept, and somewhere in the space between waking and dreams, Eleanor smiled, feeling the soft weight of blankets around her, the warm presence of the man beside her, the gentle certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, she had everything she needed. She was home, she was loved, she was whole, and that was enough. That was everything. That was the happy ending she had never quite dared to hope for, given to her not through dramatic reversal or sudden miracle, but through the slow, patient, beautiful work of living, one day at a time, one shaped vessel at a time, one small act of courage and love at a time. The end was also a beginning, and the beginning was also right now, in this quiet moment, in this peaceful night, in this ordinary, extraordinary life. Rest now. Let the darkness hold you. Let the stars keep watch. Let the sea sing its ancient song. The night has settled over Brackenshore like a mother settling a blanket over a sleeping child. The shops along the main street are dark now, their windows reflecting the silver light of the moon. The boats in the harbor rock gently on the quiet water, their masts swaying like metronomes, keeping time with some slow, peaceful music that only the sea can hear. In the pottery studio, the clay waits patiently on its shelf, knowing that morning will come, that hands will return to shape it, that the ancient dance of creation will continue as it has continued for thousands of years. The kiln is cold and quiet, holding the memory of all the fires that have burned within it, all the transformations it has witnessed. And in a small house near the lighthouse, Eleanor sleeps deeply, her breath rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of complete rest. Beside her, Daniel sleeps too, and their breathing has synchronized without them knowing it, two hearts beating in time with each other and with the great slow heartbeat of the world itself. Tomorrow will come, with its own gifts and its own challenges. But tonight there is only this: warmth and love and the deep, settled peace of a heart that has finally found its way home. Sleep well, dream gently, and know that you too are held by forces greater than yourself, by community and love and the quiet, persistent hope that lives in the heart of every good story. The wind has died down now, leaving only stillness and starlight. The tide is turning, that slow, inevitable shift that happens twice each day, as reliable as breathing, as constant as the moon that guides it. Somewhere an owl calls softly in the darkness, and somewhere else a fishing boat's bell chimes once, twice, a gentle reminder that the world goes on, that life continues, that there is always more story to be told. But not tonight. Tonight is for rest. Tonight is for letting go of all the worries and fears and hopes that fill our waking hours. Tonight is for sinking down into the soft darkness like a stone settling into sand, like a leaf drifting down through still water, like a breath slowly released after being held too long. This is one such story, and now, like all good stories, it comes softly to its close, leaving behind only peace and the gentle invitation to rest.